I'm having problems downloading the file from this email now. So bear with me, folks. Oh, okay, here we go. Open file. We will get there. One always does eventually. Opening. Okay, right. So if I now save that very quickly onto there. Browse. Desktop. Save. Okay. Right. Get back to you folks. Okay, share my screen.
On your way.
Yes, hopefully. Share screen. Let's do entire screen. No, it doesn't want to let me do that. Okay, window is fine. Yep. Share. Right. Okay. And then if I get that up. Right. Are you able to see a slideshow now?
Not quite yet.
Quite yet? Say it's coming. Okay, hold on. I see what needs to happen. Right. Okay, and share. How's that? Hide.
Quite. Yes, we're away. I think just about.
Okay. And if I do that, have you got it as you should have it? Large?
It's large. Yep, you're not in full view mode yet, but it's not bad. We can.
Is that okay? Do you need me to do anything different?
If you go to slide share view, that might help a bit.
Slideshare view. What slideshow? On my slides?
Yes, yeah. If you go down to the bottom bar, there's a little tab there that you can touch. That's nearly there.
Hold on. I don't know which. Another one popping up as that. I don't know which one I should be.
It looks like a little champagne glass, doesn't it, on the bottom?
It looks like a little screen.
Or a glass or a screen. You've got notes, and you got 3, and then you got that. It's the 4th one along from what says notes.
It's the one next to the volume slider.
Yeah, next to the volume slider.
Right down the bottom right hand corner.
Do you mean like if I've got my slides completely open on slideshow?
Yeah, the moment we can see all your slides down the side on the left hand side. Yeah.
It just makes each one bigger.
Sorry, everyone. What screen are we talking about? Are we talking about the screen with you lot on it, the Zoom screen, or are we talking about your
PowerPoint screen?
Your PowerPoint. Okay. It's the little screen down the bottom, down the very bottom of the slideshow screen. Down the very bottom, you've got the volume thing on the right, and next to it on the left, there's a little thing that looks like a screen or a glass. Tap on that, and you get it bigger. It goes bigger.
Mine screen. I might maybe do it a different way. No.
Okay.
Oh, that's not good, is it? Because you've got it tiny.
Well, let's try it as it is then.
And just do one at a time, yeah.
We just yeah we can manage. At least I can see it quite well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go from the top then. That'd be brilliant. Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. Right. Hello. Thank you very much for having me. This is the first time I've spoken about this book, so I'm kind of I'm trying it out on you, really, which hopefully will be quite nice. So I now can't see if anybody puts anything in the chat pane. So I'll leave it up to Ian to let me know if that happens and tell me what it is that's been said. But I don't mind interruptions at all. So please do feel free to do that. And apologies if I sometimes I'm looking over there because I'm going to read a few sort of excerpts as we go along. So this book is out on the 22nd of August. It's my third monograph. I have to say, a bit like a pop star, only definitely not. This has been the difficult third album, partly due to COVID, but partly I think because I've been in this kind of realm of material culture studies for a long time, and it took a long time to feel that there was something new to say. So, as I say in the introduction of the book, I kind of started it thinking I would add to some rather well-honed discussions that are out there about material culture. And I became quite disillusioned. And it wasn't until I attempted to bring in the concept of the Anthropocene and relate our relations with material objects to that it started to make sense to me again. So that is essentially what the book is about and what I'm going to talk about tonight. So that is the book. Objects and the Anthropocene is the subtitle. And it explores the concept of entanglement as a way of thinking about our relationship with material objects. So as part of that, it looks at various ethnographic case studies, some of which I'm going to just give you some snippets of in tonight's talk. In the book, they include studies of, and I use all these things in inverted commas very carefully. Most of the time, people self-define as these things. So shopaholics, which I know is not always a term everybody wants to have applied. Hoarders, again, controversial one. Makers, people who were involved in what you might call kind of artisan crafts, either for their living or in a very kind of deep way as a hobby. And minimalists, and that's interesting because I use the term minimalists, but that could mean what I would call stylistic minimalists, who may have also shed lots of possessions, but who were essentially concerned, at least initially, with style, and also downsizers who didn't always necessarily care about what their style looked like, whether it was minimalist in a stylistic way at all, but who had also shed possessions. So the book discusses entanglement in light of the part consumption plays in environmental concerns. And essentially that is the kind of joining of the two realms of concepts work that has been done and that I hope to get to tonight, but it's a tall order. And it talks about this in relation to our sense of time and of our own place in the world. So things like deep time come into the book. I'm probably not going to have time to get into them tonight, but maybe we will in our discussion. So that's what the book is all about. It's a little bit what tonight's talk is going to be about as well. Okay. So essentially, I should give a bit of context, really, just in case anybody is sort of unaware of this term of the Anthropocene. It was introduced by a scientist, Paul Crutzen, who first suggested we were living in this thing called the Anthropocene, which is a new geological epoch in which humans are the thing that most alters the planet. So prior to that, we were living in the Holocene, and then the Anthropocene followed. And at the core of that concept is the idea that humans have never been so central to or so entangled with the world's challenges and potentially with the world's demise. And we've never had such an impact on nature. The start date of the Anthropocene is kind of pertinent here because it generally is agreed that it coincides with the 1950s, with mass industrialization, with globalization. So I'm just going to kind of read a little extract about that. It was at this point that the socio-economic changes associated with the industrial revolutions of the West in the 18th and 19th century manifested in a huge increase in the production of manufactured goods. The extraction of natural resources in order to manufacture these things saw technology interrupting nature as never before. Globalization proper had begun. This era of globalization, now frequently agreed to be the start of the Anthropocene, was fueled in the West not least by a new idea that consumption was good for us. So this is how consumption then enters into the discussions about the Anthropocene. The thinking of John Maynard Keynes had begun to be cautiously embraced by Roosevelt's government in the US following the Great Depression, and by the late 1930s was widely accepted there and in other places. So I go on to kind of give some context about how Keynesianism very much informed economic recovery, and absolutely key is the idea, the rejection of what's called Say's law. In other words, that supply will create its own demand. So the rejection of that idea, and the idea that investment and marketing actually was needed to create demand for consumption, that it wouldn't happen simply through supply. And with that, that consumption was the economic savior, in effect, and the way to rebuild. And that consumers were very important sort of soakers up of non-necessary production, of additional production necessary for recovery, but not necessary in terms of the things that were needed. So it was the medicine that the economy required, and it's the only medicine politicians have used since, I argue, discuss. So this burst of production in the 1950s was then followed by the neoliberalism of the Thatcher-Reagan era, which added another layer on top of that, and resulted in what many have now referred to as fast capitalism. It's a term originally Ben Agger came up with it in his book, Fast Capitalism. So this was the promotion of consumerism as part of a range of apparent freedoms, in inverted commas, which any citizen of a developed democratic country ought to demand. And that accelerated the previously kind of carefully cajoled demand for new products into this idea of it being a lifestyle right. It is your right, and it is a freedom to consume. Okay, so that's a bit of context. So because of that, many people have decided they prefer to call the Anthropocene the Capitalocene, because they don't think it should be kind of prized apart from that particular era of capitalism. And there have been many examples of books about, for example, Fossil Capital, Andreas Malm, Naomi Klein, the kind of usual suspects in a way, who have made that argument, which is, of course, a very valid one. I suppose I just want to add caveats to that to say, personally, and in this book, I don't blame it on capitalism per se, but on a particular sort of brand of capitalism, if you like, certainly potentially on Keynesianism. And also I acknowledge that other political systems have not been so great to the environment either. And we could look at Judith Shapiro's work on Mao's industrial revolution in China under communism, for example. So I just wanted to caveat that. So we arrive at this situation where essentially the amount of stuff and our usage of it impacts on climate change, of course, and stuff therefore matters when it comes to the challenges of the Anthropocene. We need to interact differently with this stuff in order to address our own place within the Anthropocene. And various smart solutions are often kind of put to us that tackle essentially stuff behaving differently, or us being able to continue how we interact with stuff as a result of how it behaves. But I and many others are of the opinion that alongside that, we also need to question our deeper relationship with stuff. And that in questioning that relationship, we come up with some paradoxes about this concept of the Anthropocene. So that is in a large part what the kind of tail end of the book is about, really. Okay, so this concept of entanglement, let's get on to that now. What are entangled things? What do I mean by that? Always good to start with the dictionary definition. So this is from the Cambridge Dictionary. There are two parts to the definition in most dictionaries you look at. The first is this condition of being wrapped and twisted together in a mass. And the second is a more kind of a psychological aspect of it, which is a situation or relationship that you are involved in that's difficult to escape from. So I started from that, and it brought Louis de Bernier's description in Captain Corelli's Mandolin of the trees growing together and the tree roots. And he says something about love and how it's not always that the trees necessarily want to be growing together, but they are aware that to separate would just be detrimental to both of them, and possibly result in something even more drastic happening to one or other of them. So that's entanglement. It's not a straightforward kind of reciprocal relationship necessarily. It's complicated. So I started from that, and I thought that was useful to me. So there are various kind of senses that come off the back of that. There's a sense in that we have to look after the material thing. We have to engage in stewardship of it in some sense, if we are not to prize apart our roots in the manner described by de Bernier. There's the sense that a thing has journeyed with us, or at least with those who've had a profound influence on us in our lives. It might be that we've inherited the thing, for example. And because of that it's so much part of us, it can't really be considered a possession in the usual sense, in a kind of pure and simple way. It's yes.
A quick intro. Somebody's asking, should the slides have moved on at all?
Yes.
Ah.
Yes, absolutely they should. I have been moving them on, but they haven't moved on.
We're still on number 2. Well, hang on. We've jumped to 4 now.
Yeah, which is correct. Okay, so
okay.
Yeah. Maybe I should stay not on slideshow.
Alison, if you on the top ribbon at the top there, about towards the right, it says use presenter view. If you untick that. Yeah, along to the left a little bit, just above the teddy bear's head.
Which must be
left. It says use presenter view.
Oh, right, yes, untick that. Okay.
And then go to monitor, which is just above it.
Yeah.
Select the monitor you want to use. And then it should work.
It says automatic. Is that okay?
But it should make it less confusing. It should just be on one screen.
It's always good, isn't it? So if I now go back to slideshow.
Yeah, or from beginning, which is along the left-hand side.
Yeah.
You should be able
or from current slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I move back a slide, do you see a kind of planet?
Still not saying it.
Oh.
I think it's sharing the wrong screen, I think.
Okay, hang on.
If you go to that monitor one where it says automatic,
yeah,
I think if you select the monitor that you want, then it should work properly.
Primary monitor is the only other option. I'll select that now. Yeah.
I'm out of suggestions.
That hasn't done anything, has it?
Well, you're now moving slides.
Shall I try sharing something again? Hang on. Window. Share. Has that made any difference to anything? See, it tells me it's sharing it.
Well, we can see the slides.
Yeah, we can still
down
see
the left-hand side. Just keep tapping on one after the other. It's okay. We can see them.
Yeah. As long as you can move them, okay.
I can move them fine. They're moving for me.
Try to tap on slide 5 and let's see what happens to us.
Okay. I'm on slide 5.
Yeah,
It comes up fine on the screen, so it's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I think we've got that sorted now.
It's fine.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll stay in this mode.
Stay in that mode, yeah. Thanks, Alice.
It's not a risk it. Okay. Okay. So I started to think about entanglement and what that meant based on that dictionary definition, and how it was also about a sense of not being in complete control of a relationship with the thing in question, of kind of not feeling we have this choice, that we have to remain with it. And that put me in mind of stuff I'd read many, many years ago by Henri Lefebvre, the French sociologist. And he touches upon entanglement in a very obscure part of volume 3 of Critique of Everyday Life, which I'm geeky enough to have read in French for my PhD because I'm some kind of glutton for punishment. So I went back to that and tried to find the bit where he talks about that. And that was quite useful. So I'll share that kind of bit. He essentially attempts to explain the difference between possession and entanglement, and he defines entanglement as a coming together and becoming of object and person through lived experience, which I thought was really, really helpful and sort of tapped into that definition, and the idea of roots being torn apart as well. So for Henri Lefebvre, entanglement meant enjoying an object in the total human meaning of the word enjoyment. It meant having a rich relationship with the object and knowing that through it, one was moving into complex networks of human relations. So entanglement for Lefebvre sat in contrast to possession and was to be strived for. It was an attempt to fundamentally change our engagement with it. For him, therefore, the notion of non-possession of property misunderstood the issue completely, as objects are not simply important insofar as they are goods, but also as a shell for objective being, for human relations to other people, their social behaviour, etc. Therefore, to argue non-possession as superior to possession situates profound human reality within the absence of human relations. Yet he was not pro-possession either, arguing that engaging in the debate on possession results in an argument for equal possession for all. Within this system, each person would own a minuscule part of socially important things, instead of social wealth being increased for everyone. In other words, it's not about owning a plot in the mountains, it's about the mountains being open to all. So this is what Lefebvre sought in terms of looking for an engagement that made the person's own sense of themselves and their lived experience somehow indeterminable from the object. That's what he wanted. That's what he thought was the best form of entanglement. Okay, so you're probably wondering why on earth there's a picture of a cuddly toy on there, and I shall explain. This is Lenny. He is the favourite toy of my daughter and has been since she was under a year old. Anyone who has a child with a similar favourite will understand how these things become like a family member, and also understand the fear of losing them, which is very palpable sometimes. Lenny has been everywhere with us. He was there throughout babyhood. He witnessed the waving goodbye on the first day of school. He kept me company at my daughter's behest on occasions I was going off to work for a longer day than usual. Holidays, special occasions. He listened to woes, soaked up tears, shared joys, and silently gave love. This is not anthropomorphism. We do not talk about Lenny as if he has human reactions or emotions. It's an acknowledgement of what his presence actually does, regardless of the fact he is not human. At one point, about 4 years into his life, Lenny's neck, the part of him that my daughter's then tight little hand preferred to hold him by, poor Lenny, became so thin due to its stuffing having been crushed that he could no longer hold his head up. Love had worn him away. We decided he needed a little restuffing, not too much, just enough that he could hold his head up once again, but not so much that the wearing away with love was rendered invisible. So, long story short, he was restuffed with some lamb's wool from a friend had collected it off the gate that enclosed her sheep. And we thought that would be a kind of particularly nice way to repair Lenny, because then even the stuffing had meaning. What was supposed to happen was that I was supposed to go in to the neck and put the lamb's wool in the neck. But that wasn't possible because it would have made a very visible scar. So in the actual event, we decided we would have to go in via his rear end. Poor Lenny. My daughter assured me Lenny would not mind, so the operation began, with the synthetic stuff being carefully pushed further up his body into his neck and the lamb's wool filling the gap that was therefore created in his bottom. This process continued until Lenny's neck was just firm enough, but not too firm. Okay, Lenny's operation was such a success that he felt even more of an entangled part of us. So it was decided he should have his own collar with his name engraved on it and contact details on the back in case he ever got lost. If we did lose him, it would be extremely distressing for both of us, I should add, because he'd been through so much with us. He's no longer simply a possession. Our roots are entangled and we are not in control of that. So Lenny is on that slide because he's the best example I have of an entangled object that is mine and my daughter's, but not a possession in the usual way. Okay. So that's what I'm sort of basing entanglement on in the book. And then there are various kind of case studies in there. I've chosen the extreme in a way because I think people think of hoarders and minimalists as kind of opposites, which they're not necessarily, but I've chosen these two. So I will tell you briefly about each one. So there are various case studies in the book, but the one I've picked here is Callum, not his real name. And essentially, Callum's father had died when he was 12 years old, and he says he had never really got over his father's death. And when his stepfather came on the scene, he encouraged him and his mum to do something with the remaining boxes of his father's stuff that they didn't want. And he kind of resented that. So he decided to take it to as soon as he got his own home, he took it to his own home. Okay. So it's a classic Victorian semi-detached layout. It has a lounge that's been knocked through to the dining room, providing one single large living space and a small conservatory on the back. The lounge part of the downstairs and one of the double bedrooms upstairs are completely unusable as they are full floor to ceiling and up to the doorways of boxes of things. In the lounge, the boxes block out all light from the front windows, so the dining room part of the large room is very dark, and the placement of all the seating means one sits staring at the boxes. In the bedroom, there's just enough room for the door to open. There is an interesting and very definite split between the rooms and the belongings they contain in Callum's house. The boxes in the lounge contain his father's belongings and have been there since he bought the house 10 years ago. The things upstairs in the bedroom are not all in boxes and are not his father's belongings. They are things he's gathered since moving in that remind him of places he's travelled. He's a prolific traveller. When showing the upstairs hoard he's gathered on his travels, Callum stands casually and speaks confidently. He picks up individual items and laughs at some memory they trigger, or explains how he still finds the things interesting or where he was when he bought it. For example, he picks up a tiki carving from New Zealand and says how he now feels he kind of buys more original things than that. But at the time, he thought that was a very sort of authentic item to buy. He is at ease with this aspect of his own past and even displays pride in having gone on a journey as a seasoned traveller. Compared to when he shows his upstairs hoard, when talking about his downstairs hoard, Callum is visibly less confident and slightly awkwardly and less straight. He speaks more quietly and seems to not quite find words or know what to say at certain points. He seems baffled in some strange way by the mass of things. Unlike his upstairs hoard, he cannot explain where every object comes from or why he has it. In fact, he admits he does not know what is inside every box. He just knows it's all his dad's stuff, and it dates from when they cleared things out. He picks up one or two things, a banner from an event his dad once organised, a mug that has been his favourite, and seems unable to say much about them despite being clearly moved. He doesn't know why he keeps it all, but it's clear that he cannot get rid of it. He explains how he has many friends who offer to help him go through it all, but he just doesn't want to, and he can't explain why. I've become kind of embarrassed about it, not with my friends, but with people I have to explain it to who don't know me, but I'd still rather not open it. To be honest, most of the time I forget it's there, he laughs. I do want to do something about it really deep down. I just don't know what, so it feels pointless to start opening the boxes. It's not really because of how upset I'd feel. It's more just that I don't know what to do with it all. I want to keep it, but not like it is. So this is a really good example of the argument that Callum is clearly very physically entangled with a huge amount of stuff, but he's not necessarily entangled with many particular individual items in that stuff. He's entangled with the hoard as a kind of a holistic thing. And this is spoken about quite a lot in the sort of literature on hoarding, whether this is a kind of healthy entanglement, because if you don't know what you've got, how can you be entangled with it psychologically? So, and we might come back to that idea. Okay, on the other end of the scale, arguably, although I think it's more complicated, is Dawn, who has downsized. So she's in the minimalist chapter, but I think she's not really a minimalist in the way we think of it. But I explain that in the book. Standing on the steps of her tiny house movement, when you buy, sometimes it's a trailer or something, or a sort of bespoke tiny house, but it can be as cheap as £10,000. You just need land to put it on and no planning permission. Standing on the steps of her tiny house, on the piece of land her friend lets her use, Dawn cuts an unusual figure. One doesn't get the impression she's styled herself in any particular way, with any particular clothes or hairstyle, yet there is something almost 1950s housewife about the way she's wearing an apron pinched in at the waist. She is jaunty, not for one instant dour or indeed even well-meaning. She comes across as totally out of kilter with her surroundings. It's not what the stereotypes of people who choose to downsize and live in a tiny house would conjure at all. By her own admission, she doesn't even consider herself to be particularly environmentally concerned, certainly not until very recently. Despite looking out of kilter in this setting, it quickly becomes apparent that Dawn is actually very much at one with it. She smiles in an easy way that belies her years and her life experiences. She's in her 60s just, she says. Her children left home years ago, and having brought them up on her own, she found herself very much alone once they had gone. Her empty nest caused her to have a bit of a late midlife crisis and start to question all aspects of her life. She'd never got much joy from her work at a local accountancy company, and she couldn't face continuing in that line until her state retirement age. She could have given that up and just about managed financially to keep living in her house. She is at pains to make it clear that she was not forced to downsize, but that the house felt too big without the now grown-up children in it, and she felt she needed a complete change. She goes on to say, I had no motivation to stay, etc., etc. Okay, since moving into her tiny house, Dawn has found everything and more that she hoped, and a few things that surprised her. It's been something of a voyage of discovery. She's been surprised that she doesn't miss the mementos and stuff she had around in her old house from her children's childhoods. A single family photo is fixed to the wall of her tiny house, an informal shot of her and her two sons sat round a table laughing. There's an air of cheekiness to it, as if someone had just told a slightly inappropriate joke and then captured the moment where, in spite of themselves, all three had laughed. There are no other pictures or photos in her house, but rather in some of the places the walls provide a space to hang something. There is a functional object that is hung rather like an ornament might be. For example, Dawn is creating a meadow around three sides of her tiny home, and the large round wooden sieve that she uses to scatter the seeds is hanging in an almost decorative way near the small sofa. Some basic hand tools, a hammer, screwdriver, trowel, hand rake, and chisel hang on a peg near the door. There's more description about particular tablecloth, which was the one always used for picnics with her children, and the embroidery on the bed cover, which was done by her mother in a traditional folk Indian art style, despite the fact she'd never been to India and would never travel. So these are things that kind of very much remind her of the character of the members of her family, whether they're still present or not. So that reminds me of my funny old mum and how she lived her life, says Dawn. In fact, Dawn is entangled with so many of the things in her tiny house. It's not cluttered, it only contains essential items, but it's certainly not minimalist stylistically. It shows its workings, as it were, and cares not for any specific style. It is simply a house of highly functional and/or entangled things. Certainly, it has enabled Dawn to live in the way she wants, without engaging in the work that bored her and without feeling trapped in her own past. Okay, so that's a sort of taster of some of the case studies and how I hope you can see they would kind of make you think about what do we actually mean by entanglement, and perhaps some of the scenarios where society tends to judge a person to be either disentangled or overly entangled are not quite so straightforward. And perhaps there's a useful distinction to be made between what you might call physical entanglement, simply having lots of stuff, and psychological or emotional entanglement. And that's kind of one of the key points that I make. So this is a conclusion, but I must admit it's it contains quite a lot of the body of the book, but it's sort of long, complicated ideas. So it's probably better done as part of a discussion. We are attached in both positive and negative ways to actual things, but we are still too unattached to the process of entanglement. This is one of the arguments that I make. Recognizing the gap between our physical entanglement, the amount of stuff, and our psychological disentanglement or entanglement, our love for those things, will involve deeper entanglement as well as the relinquishing of possessions. A deeper psychological entanglement with fewer things is perhaps the solution. But I want to be very careful here, because this naturally would take us down a kind of Marie Kondo path, but in a kind of sort of Marie Kondo does existential crisis, which is not where I wish to go at all. But it taps into a deeper change in our relation with the world, I feel. And this is where the Anthropocene comes sort of crashing back into this whole discussion, because there is a paradox of the Anthropocene, and that is that it's a concept which, on one hand, takes away human agency. It places us within deep time, within this kind of immense geological epoch, as a tiny and the most recent part of that. And as it stands, where we are in that, a tiny epoch compared to the others. On the other hand, it pushes agency upon humans, blaming us for the extreme challenges of the current era and looking to us to solve those challenges. So on one hand, we're part of something way more powerful than us, bigger than us, deeper than us. On the other hand, only we can save ourselves from ourselves. So I will conclude by reading a sort of final extract, slightly edited extract about that. The current mainstream ecological perspective asks humans to recognize the impact of their own consumerist behavior on the planet, their dominance in the Anthropocene, and importantly, what change is required of them in order for a livable future to be possible. This stance asks us to save ourselves from ourselves. As Scott Hamilton puts it, the human being becomes a new geological entity which, and this is a quote, rather than protecting itself from physical threats in an external world, now subsumes that world by making itself the simultaneous subject-object of security. So this is the paradox of the Anthropocene, that humans are a new geological entity and therefore part of nature, and yet are asking themselves to solve the problem of nature. Perhaps best solved by humans recognizing, says Hamilton, that they are actually disentangled from nature. In arguing this, though, he doesn't mean entanglement is not a truth, but that we are still creating of ourselves a separate entity. So there is, according to Hamilton, a space for humans to take responsibility and make those ethical decisions about something they perceive to be outside of themselves, in other words, nature. We can, he argues, embrace humanity's disentanglement from nature as a social space within which to recognize and act ethically against humanity's catastrophic effects on the planet. This requires grasping the lesson that humanity will never be fully enmeshed or entangled with nature. What seems to be at stake here is a useful difference in and our psychological entanglement. We've never been unentangled, so why do we behave as though we are? Or to put it a different way, why do we insist on psychological disentanglement from things and nature and its accompanying behaviors, irresponsible behaviors, when it's evident that we are and always have been physically entangled? And this is the real crux of it. The proposed reconfiguration of our psychological relationship with nature involves a radical dislocation from what previously existed and what currently prevails, I should add. It involves recognizing that whilst the concept of the Anthropocene acknowledges humankind as the most powerful influence on the planet, it simultaneously acknowledges that the impact of our influence, in other words, nature's power to create climatic events, is potentially more devastating. And this is why it's a paradox, and this is why it's something that people grapple with, policymakers grapple with. The Anthropocene gives us the most power above anything else, but in recognizing our negative environmental actions and acknowledging our potential for change, it doesn't make us all powerful. That is still, nature is in the place of God in that sense. So it simultaneously humbles and aggrandizes the human species. And, you know, we can discuss the extent to which we may or may not think that's true. Even as our actions occupy a negligible time span in relation to the history of the planet, we are shown to have had an effect that will be visible in the Earth's, for the rest of the planet's history. So this is the kind of difficult situation that we find ourselves in. And my work really in this book has been to say, if our relationships with objects are important in terms of the environment, how do they reflect and also have the potential to change our more existential relationship with us as beings in the current era that we live in? So I will leave it there. I should just say that these images are by a friend of mine called James Hutchinson, and they were done by his mother while she was undergoing unsuccessful, in the end, treatment for cancer. So they are unfinished, and they are another excellent example of entangled objects because they are her closest friends. But of course, made out of papier-mâché, they also include the kind of the size and the signs of her own fingers. So for him, they have many layers of entanglement. The newspaper used is also from the day. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Alison, very much indeed. There we lost a last sentence there, but never mind. Could we now start to move into a response mode and questions and answers to that? Anne has put something in the chat there. She says, it seems to me that there is a big overlap between entanglement and attachment ideas. The Bowlby theory and styles. Any thoughts on that, Alison? And if you could maybe stop sharing the screen soon, then we could see people's hands go up.
Stop share. Okay.
There we are. Lovely. So, what about Anne's point there about entanglement and attachment theory? Yeah.
Yes, I think there is, and there has been quite a lot written by it. particularly by a French sociologist called Philippe Rochat, who writes about the history of possession. I think that's probably the distinction to be made, that attachment rather sort of sits alongside the concept of possession, whereas in entanglement absolutely may well involve attachment, but it's not always an attachment of choice. I suppose that's the difference, really, that it's that kind of image of the roots being entangled, not necessarily through choice. It's that second layer of the meaning of entanglement, you know, where you're embroiled in something that you haven't necessarily chosen in a straightforward sense to become attached to. So I agree. I think there's some nuance to it, though.
Thanks.
Can I come in there? I haven't actually. I was just about. I need to head off, but thank you so much for picking up on that question. I mean, I would just say to that your attachment style and how you attach to things isn't a choice either. It's, you know, it goes way back to birth, what things that happen even in the womb. You know, it's not a choice in the same.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah. I think it's useful to sort of think around those concepts for sure. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I'm sorry, but I do need to head off now. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. There's another question there from Henry. Are you still there, Henry? I think you're saying you're dashing off as well, but he's sort of saying, I'd like to ask about the role that consciousness plays in entanglement. I.e., if we are consciously entangled, does that give us agency to act potentially? So, yeah. Any thoughts on that, Alison? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Yeah, and I suppose in a way that's probably what is loosely being promoted, a kind of a conscious entanglement, you know, a sort of a recognition of that psychic relationship with the things that do matter, and as a result of that, the ability to kind of not have that relationship with the things that don't. But and I suppose, like, part of that awareness is about how that impacts on your sense of your own existence existentially on the planet, you know. Yeah.
Anybody else got a question there?
I've just seen Gary's comment. Maybe time to get Lenny chipped. Don't think we haven't thought about it, Gary. But I don't think anyone would scan him, so I'm not sure if the chip would be useful.
No, that's an interesting one, wouldn't it? Yes. Actually, that does lead on to a thought that occurred to me, is this sort of entanglement that we're getting, and potentially even more in the future, the fact that we're becoming part object ourselves, in the sense that our relationship with things like wearing your glasses to start with, and now we're talking about joints being replaced, chips inside us, moving into what might be called the post-human era, where we are incredibly entangled with objects. Is that a direction of travel, and what are the consequences of it for our sense of being, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big question with that is, would that make us feel more or less entangled with nature? You know, because we tend to sort of perceive of those things that are have become parts of our bodies, for example, very much as, you know, objects within something that is nature. Our organic matter has something alien and non-organic inside it. So I suppose the question is, you know, does that ironically make the distinction between the two even more apparent, or not? You know, do we, is that the ultimate merging of subject and object? Yeah.
The ultimate, yes, that could well be the state we're heading towards, that merging subject and object.
Yeah.
Thanks. Gary, your question there. Yeah. Gary, you muted. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. That was very thought-provoking. I enjoyed it. When you're talking about entanglement, is there always that emotional connection, that emotional component in the entanglement, in the way that you're using it?
I think there is in the way I'm using it. Yeah. And I think I've probably committed to using it in that way. Yes. Yeah. But that's an interesting question. Why do you ask? Do you think it's not useful, or?
No, I think it is useful. Yeah. I put something else in the chat. I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us more about the reason why we become entangled. And I was wondering if it is in some way related to a seeking of meaning and purpose in one's life.
Yeah, I think it is sometimes for some people in the things they get entangled with. And I think sometimes the meaning, the meaningfulness of life is almost sort of forced upon them. So one of the other case studies was a woman who had ended up collecting lots of plants from her parents' garden after they'd passed away, and planted them in her own. At the time, feeling quite positive about that, but ending up really resenting it because she had to keep the blinking roses alive, and she didn't want to, but she had to because it was so symbolic. So that wasn't really. I mean, it was an emotional entanglement, but it wasn't. Not in the usual way. It was a kind of put upon her, and then she really didn't want it anymore. She'd inherited these things that were not doing what they should have been doing for her in her view. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Thanks. Marina. Yeah.
Thanks. I feel like I'm a bit new in your team. I studied in Schumacher College, and the link was provided by my tutor, Emma. So I'm happy to hear the topic that I'm really interested in, because I'm a designer, and I came from the other end of the problem where I participate in decision-making. And I have a background of product and industrial design craft. And in my dissertation, I tried to explore connection between narratives and materials or our tangible experiences. And my question is how actually in the very beginning of decision-making stages, being a designers, we can create healthy entanglement.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I've been involved in the last sort of couple of years with people who are sort of in the same realm as you, actually. And one person who runs a repair cafe, but he's a designer by training, really. He just happens to run a repair cafe. And someone else who is a designer who's really into like multifunctional objects. So I think that's potentially one answer. You probably know more about it than me, but objects that double up in their use or that grow with the person. I mean, I think those bits of furniture that grow with children are classic examples, aren't they? It was your cot and now it's your chair. We just move a bit round, and I think that's probably a good example of that. Objects that enable you to remain entangled with them over many years, potentially throughout a lifetime. That's one aspect. I think also there was something about what you said put me in mind of political objects that become entangled as well. I think actually, well, they don't really need to be conventional objects. I'm thinking of Mao badges is the classic one, and how they've it becomes a trinket that you can pick up at an antiques market, and you can now buy them. Whereas obviously when Mao was in power, you couldn't possibly buy it because you couldn't put a price on it because his image is priceless, So things like that kind of changed. But also more recently, with the destruction of I can't remember the name of it, but the dam in Ukraine, suspected by Russian forces, but there's no proof. That destruction of nature, that ecocide, and the kind of destroying of objects, even nature objects that have been very entangled with a landscape that somebody loves, or with the survival of the growing of a certain crop, for example. I think, we could think about those objects in terms of how they're designed, with all of that kind of weight of the history of design and destruction at play. Perhaps that was a hugely broad philosophical answer to a very specific question. I apologize.
Yeah. Thank you, Marina. Glenn.
Hi, Alison. Thank you very much for that. And I know you're not coming at it from this angle at all, but I wondered if you'd thought about looking at the way that entanglement has become a very important and dominant concept within the quantum view of the world, within quantum physics. And it jolted me again when yourself and Ian were talking about the ultimate merging, because in a sense that's what it's trying to get to, and how it's led many Western physicists to recognizing a non-Western view of the world and how things are entangled in that way. And is that not something that can take us closer to really understanding our involvement with nature?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I've even crossed it out in my notes because I knew I wouldn't have time to say it, but I had to put in a whole section that was precisely that caveat, that talked about, for example, Australian Aboriginal communities for whom this whole entanglement idea is just the way of seeing the world. It's not something that, they need to get their heads around. So I have to admit that this book is very much written from a kind of Western industrialized perspective. And when I talk about entanglement, I am talking about a certain we that isn't those kinds of indigenous cultures. In the book, I do kind of mention that and say, animism, for example, and and I use Jane Bennett's work quite a lot because she talks about that. I think there is a difficult line to walk, though, between acknowledging that and drawing from that in a useful way, and simply sort of fetishizing it in the worst kind of I don't know what to call it, but take it, just using it in too easy a manner, as if this is the solution, we'll just get a bit Eastern about it.
No, but the thing is,
I'm not accusing you of doing that. I'm sure it doesn't look like I've done that. Purely selfish.
No, but I think that the point I was trying to make really is that it's becoming very dominant in Western physics, Western science.
Okay.
That's where the cutting edge of quantum mechanics and physics has taken us, and then it's kind of raising all these questions about the legitimacy of some of the older views of the world and so on. But it's very much from a scientific perspective, and as I say, I know that's not the angle that you were coming at.
If only my poor brain would work in that way, I would be very happy. But but it does come into some of the literature, even in the sort of philosophical side of things, that is mentioned. So I know what you're talking about. And I think it's useful to kind of acknowledge that and bring that in. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. Any more immediate questions from anybody? I think Gary, Glenn, you put something in the chat there.
Gary's put something in the chat there.
About sustainable, maintainable.
Yeah, I was just responding to Marina's comment about designing things, to promote entanglement, and iPhone, etc. have done that, but they've entangled us in the concept, and what is provided through that product. But their business model is not maintainable. Their business model is not providing products that are maintainable and sustainable. In fact, they design their products so they fail over 4 or 5 years. So you have to buy a new one. And from the perspective of the environment and the customer, that is really dreadful. Yeah, but they've hooked us into that. So coming back to that whole thing about capitalism, and I agree with you that capitalism is not necessarily a bad thing, but the kind of capitalism we've been exposed to in terms of the environment that we live in, the commercial environment we live in is certainly not a healthy one for us or the planet, and it's only of short-term gain to the businesses themselves. But they only care about the short-term gains. They don't care really about the long-term, or they don't seem to.
Yeah.
Certainly something that interests me a great deal is this whole concept of making things to last, and how we can shift that whole way of thinking from this throwaway type of society we have to the sort of the permanence of what we have and work with. So yeah, does entanglement help us to look after things more and preserve things?
Yeah, I believe it can, and I hope so. I think that's part of the motivation for putting it out there as a concept, because I think it can, and that kind of built-in obsolescence that we're talking about could tumble from grace.
Yeah. Right. Good. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, very interesting. There's sort of this material entanglement with things and stuff, with all of the emotional and ideational associations. But then we're also in an interesting world where we're moving into sort of a combination of virtual reality and augmented reality, which some might argue is a kind of somewhat dematerialized world. But of course, speaking from a physics point of view, that those experiences still require energy. So, so we've got energy and stuff. And as somebody was saying earlier on about the nature of interpretations of quantum mechanics, which you might say is the sort of fundamental aspect of stuff. That's another strange world of form and energy somehow playing together. And the other sort of take, I'm just wondering whether these are different perspectives on this whole area, is actually the world of ideas. Ideas are otherwise known as forms in the mind, stuff in the mind, and are we in some sense is deeply entangled in that web of ideas that we've ingested and incorporated in ourselves? And yeah, I know, to what extent are we a collection of ideas behaving in a certain way, albeit in a sort of neat computer instantiation? I don't know. I'm just mulling over the whole idea of ideas and entanglement and form and emergent properties and all of that. I mean, after all, the stuff is in the form of objects. Eventually, it's going to erode, decay, be resolved back down to its constituent parts in some way or other. But for a time, they look like things in which we invest, into which we invest attachments and connectivity of one sort or another. It's a really interesting area, and I've got no real grasp on it, but it just find it quite provoking. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I like that phrase, stuff in the mind. It's stuff in the mind. that's what an idea is. I've got too much stuff in my mind.
Right. Any more thoughts, anybody? One question in a way, I don't know whether it's that relevant. Did you come across any kind of gender aspects of entanglement? I feel that I have a different relationship to things than my wife does.
Do you?
Yeah, I think so.
That's interesting. Why? In what way?
Well, there's something I'm intimate with as objects, my tools, my books, etc.
Yeah.
And I think my wife has a different set of sort of interests in other things. I was just trying to, in a way, I tend to categorize things a lot. I was thinking the categories of objects. There are some that are decorative and some that are functional. Some are really very intimate things that you know, like your what was his name? I've forgotten his name now.
Lenny.
Lenny, yes, Lenny.
Yeah.
Hugely into it, I've got a whole set of tools. Some of I inherited them from my grandfather, and I feel incredibly intimate with them.
Yeah.
I don't feel that. I think that's a masculine thing. I don't know.
Ah, that's interesting. I don't know, but my mum also has tools that were her grandmother's gardening tools, and she is incredibly attached to them. And she would say, because her grandmother's hands have worn away part of the rake, for example.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so she can actually put her hands in the shape of her grandmother's hands on this rake,
Yeah.
and she would be distraught if that rake went missing. So,
yeah, I know that feeling very well. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know whether is there a gender dimension to object entanglement?
I suppose I wasn't looking for one. I have to confess that. So it's not an angle, and also I kind of wasn't really measuring things. I mean, I wasn't even coming at this as an anthropologist in the traditional sense. You know, I just spoke to whoever, and they were ethnographic snippets, if you like. So I don't know, because I didn't even pick equal numbers of different genders or whatever. But I don't know if anything like that came through. I think the reactions, the kind of second guessing of what society thought about one may have had a gender aspect. I think, especially amongst the hoarders, the male hoarders cared more what people thought about their hoarding than the female.
Right.
Which is quite interesting. And I wondered at the time whether it's because the hoarder is often stereotypically presented as a woman. So perhaps the female hoarders went, well, yeah, I'm a hoarder. Whereas the men went, this is not something that men are supposed to do. Although ironically, the most famous case of hoarders is two elderly brothers in New York who essentially died due to their hoarding. Something collapsed on one of them, and he was the carer for the other one, and therefore couldn't provide any food because he was stuck. And they were both found in the apartment, completely tragically. But I think the stereotype of hoarders is women, and I think the females who identified themselves as hoarders, to me, I should say, I didn't label them, didn't seem to struggle with society's reaction to them as much as the men. Yeah, but I don't know if they had a different relationship to the actual hoarding. Yeah.
I guess the classic object has always been the motor car, and that's often been sent. Identify hugely with the motor car, or at least used to.
I've just got a thought, Ian. Can I just say something?
Okay. Yeah. Go. You.
In terms of just think about in terms of entanglement with the world of art and stuff like that. You know, if you think about it, there's enough art and sculpture in the world. If you spent the next 30 years looking at all the art that exists at the moment, you'd probably only cover 5% of it. But yet there's a need in the human condition amongst artists to develop art and do more art and do more sculpture, because that expresses their emotions and their feelings. And it also tells us about, you know, the way the world works, and art can express things in a way that the human voice can't. So that's just an observation and a thought I had. Because, I mean, last 5 years, I got interested in art, and part of me thinks, please stop producing any more, because that's not going to stop people producing more, is it? The desire to create, you know?
Yeah.
And that makes the world a better place.
Do you think you could get about art like some people get about possessions, though? Do you think that you could reach a point, in theory, potentially, where you kind of go, I've got too much art and half of it is rubbish, and I don't need to engage with all of it. I now know which bits I'm properly entangled with. And, you know, do you think
Well, no, because in the world of art, I mean, I'm an expert. You consistently come across things you had no knowledge of, artists you didn't even know existed, and suddenly you see them and think, crikey, they're brilliant, and nobody's ever heard of them before. You know?
Yeah, that's nice.
It's a constant journey of exploration, really.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hugh, indeed. Yeah. Marina.
Yeah. Only if it's okay for other participants, if I'm not taking too much time. If I can ask another question.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the process of entanglement. Can you just maybe explain what you mean by that?
Oh, gosh, that's really difficult because I don't think there's sort of one single process. And I think in each case study, each person I spoke to, that process was probably very different. You know, for some people it was put upon them. For other people, they're absolutely seeking it out. For some, it kind of came as a bit of a surprise, actually, as a process of what they thought was going to be disentanglement. So I don't think there's kind of one single process. It's a really good question because it makes me wonder whether there is anything in common. I suppose, well, there's a point of recognition of entanglement at some point for everyone. That must be something in common. So that might be a sort of interesting thing to study in a way to get through that particular conundrum. You know what? You might not consciously realize the point at which you recognized you're entangled, though, I suppose. But I think that's quite interesting because there's a lot of, you know, I could look at it as the ethnographer and kind of go, that person's definitely entangled with that thing. It doesn't mean they realize they are, or that they might agree that they are. You know, that's the difficult thing, isn't it? That I'm very much kind of godlike, putting my decision about what's an entangled relationship onto these case studies. Sometimes, and not always, some people were saying, no, I'm absolutely entangled with this thing, and I'm very happy about that, and I hate that. But you know, sometimes I guess it was me saying that, which probably is proof, if we needed it, that there is no single process. Right. Not sure if that helps you as an answer, but
there we go. Nice one.
It wasn't helpful, but it was lovely. I think that's what that means.
Oh, well, thank you, Alison. Indeed, I'm just thinking again, sort of random thoughts occur to you when you start getting into fields like this. We are entangled with systems so much, and systems are objects, or partly objects, partly ideas and information, all sorts of stuff. And I'm just thinking, looking out the window, and I can see a road, and I wouldn't feel, as a system of transport, a system of getting around the place, it's incredibly important, and yet I don't feel particularly entangled with it. There's sort of a distance of ourselves from certain things that we are entangled with, but only because of the fact that they are systems that deliver to us what we need.
Yeah, maybe there's something about functionality in there.
Yes,
that we don't tend to recognize entanglement if it feels so very functional. I mean, I think it was Gary talking about being entangled with your phone, but that is, I think, probably because of the communication that enables. It's not the object, it's what the object does as the tool, isn't it? Whereas perhaps we don't quite see that with roads. Yeah, I am actually quite entangled with my road because it is an unmade road.
Oh, right.
And so those of us who live on it are technically responsible for it. But none of us have any interest in upkeeping it because we don't want cars to come down it. We love its potholes. It means nobody can come down, certainly not at speed. So we are very entangled with our road.
Lovely.
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no more questions, I'd like to vote a great deal of thank you to Alison and for opening up fusion a set of new ideas. And the book is available August the 22nd.
22nd. It's already on Amazon. I see it there. So
right. So can pre-order it now.
Yeah, apparently so.
Well, we wish you a great deal of luck with it, and I look forward to a signed copy when we meet.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much for having me do the talk. It's always very good to talk through these ideas, and believe it or not, just because you've written a book on it doesn't mean that you've kind of got things cemented in your own mind. So it's very useful to have questions asked.
Good.
So thank you.
Thank you indeed, everybody. And yeah, I look forward to see you at the next workshop. And yeah, again, thank you, Alison. Right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Liz. Bye.